She was pregnant again. HWA Yon stood in front of her bronze mirror on a cold January morning, pressing both hands flat against her belly, and felt the familiar flutter that she had only ever felt once before, in another lifetime, on a frozen riverbank where she had died. But this time was different. This time she was inside the palace walls. This time she had money hidden in 3 separate locations across the capital. This time she had allies, informants, a network of loyal people who would move mountains if she asked them to. This time Miran was sleeping in the next room, healthy and safe, with no idea that her lady had already lived this moment once and lost everything. This time the children growing inside her would not be born on a riverbank in the snow. This time they would be born into power. HWA Yon exhaled slowly, watching her reflection. She looked different from the girl she had been in her first life. Same face, technically. Same dark eyes, same sharp cheekbones, same full mouth. But the expression was entirely different. The first HWA Yon had looked at this same mirror and seen a woman hopping to be loved. The second HWA Yon looked at this mirror and saw a weapon being sharpened. "My lady." Miran's voice came softly through the door. "You're awake early." "In." Miran entered carrying a tray with warm barley tea and rice porridge. She set it on the low table and began arranging the breakfast with careful hands. She was 20 years old now, having grown up alongside HWA Yon through this second life. Loyal to the point of recklessness, sharp enough to keep secrets, brave enough to knock out a court spy without flinching. "You didn't sleep well," Miran observed. It wasn't a question. She knew her lady's face too well for pretense. "I was thinking about the pregnancy." HWA Yon looked at her sharply. Miran met her eyes without apology. "I've been with you through everything, my lady. I know what a woman looks like when she's carrying life, and I know what you look like when you're calculating." She paused. "You're doing both right now." For a moment, HWA Yon considered denying it. Then she let out a slow breath and sat down at the table. 3 months, she said quietly. "I think 3 months." Miran sat across from her, abandoning the formality of serving in favor of the intimate directness that existed only between them in private when the palace walls were just walls and not ears. "Is it the crown prince's?" "It has to be. He came to my chambers 6 weeks ago, and before that 2 months prior. The timing fits. Prince Yonson is on his country estate with a fake illness exactly where I put him. He hasn't set foot in the capital since I sent him away." HWA Yon picked up the teacup and wrapped her hands around its warmth. "These children are the crown prince's, except they weren't. Not biologically. But that was a truth that would die with HWA Yon before she ever let it surface." "What do we do?" Miran asked. HWA Yon's eyes went distant. She was thinking about the children she had held for only moments before dying. Jayan with his sharp, intelligent eyes. Minyu with his gentle, curious hands. Saren, smallest of the 3 but fiercer than both her brothers combined. She was thinking about how they had breathed, how they had cried, how they had fought to live even when she was dying beneath them. She was thinking about how she had failed them. "We do exactly what we planned," HWA Yon said. "Nothing changes. We wait until the pregnancy is undeniable. Then we control the announcement, control the narrative, make sure everyone in this palace understands that I carry the royal heir and that anything that happens to me happens to the succession. We'll make you untouchable. A while." HWA Yon sipped her tea. "Until the bobbies are born. After that, everything changes again." Miran was quiet for a moment. "The Queen Dowager will be suspicious. She knows the crown prince doesn't want you. She'll wonder how. She'll wonder, but she won't investigate, because she wants heirs more than she wants answers. She's been pressuring the crown prince for months. She'll take credit for the pregnancy privately, convince herself that her interference worked, and move on." HWA Yon set down her cup. "Vanity is the most reliable weapon against intelligent people. They always believe success was their idea." Miran shook her head slowly. "How do you know all of this? How are you always so certain?" HWA Yon looked at her loyal friend, and for a moment the weight of carrying 2 lifetimes of memory pressed down on her chest like stones. "Because I've made every mistake already," she said quietly. "And I paid for them with my life." Room was silent. Miran reached across the table and covered HWA Yon's hand with hers. It was the gesture of an equal, not a servant. It was the only kind of comfort that felt real anymore. "Then we won't make them again," Miran said. "No," HWA Yon agreed. "We won't. If you're watching this right now and you've ever had to restart something after losing everything, I want you to hear this. HWA Yon didn't come back to this life to be bitter. She came back to be better. And there is a difference between those two things that most people never figure out. Drop a comment right now and tell me, have you ever had to start over from nothing? Because I think that's what makes this story hit differently. Now stay with me. Because the palace is about to find out that a quiet woman is the most dangerous kind. The announcement of the pregnancy happened exactly as HWA Yon had planned. She waited until she was 4 months along, and the swell was unmistakable beneath her robes. She waited until a formal court gathering, with ministers and officials and the Queen Dowager all assembled in the Hall of Governance for the monthly review of kingdom affairs. She waited until she knew the Crown Prince would be there, sitting on his elevated platform, cold and distant and completely unprepared. She requested permission to address the assembly. An unusual request for a crown princess, but not unprecedented. The Queen Dowager granted it with narrowed eyes and thin lips pressed together in calculation. HWA Yon walked into the Hall of Governance in silence. She had dressed deliberately, deep teal robes with gold embroidery along the hem and collar, a formal hairstyle secured with a single jade pin that had been her grandmother's, no excessive jewels, no performance of femininity. She looked exactly like what she intended to look like, a woman who had come to deliver important information and expected to be taken seriously. Every head turned as she walked to the center of the hall. The Crown Prince watched her from his platform. His expression gave nothing away, but she saw the slight tension around his eyes. He didn't know what she was about to do. That uncertainty was unusual for him, and it showed. HWA Yon stopped in the center of the hall with the assembled court forming a horseshoe around her. She didn't bow to the assembly. She bowed only to the Queen Dowager, precisely and correctly, and then she straightened and addressed the room. "Have news that concerns the royal succession," she said clearly. Her voice carried without effort, trained by years of practice. "I am with child." Silence that followed was the most satisfying sound HWA Yon had ever heard. Then it broke all at once into a cascade of sound. Ministers exclaiming, court ladies gasping, officials turning to whisper to each other. The Queen Dowager's hands tightening on her armrests, not in distress but in something that looked almost like triumph, and the Crown Prince. Jinhyun's face underwent a series of rapid changes that HWA Yon catalogued with clinical precision. Shock first, then disbelief, then a careful blankness as he reassembled his composure in real time. Then, most interesting of all, a fractional narrowing of his eyes as he looked at her standing in the center of the hall with all the calm of someone who had been expecting this moment for months, because she had been, and he was only now realizing it. "Princess," the Queen Dowager said, her voice carrying easily over the noise of the hall. "How far along?" "For months, Your Majesty. The royal physicians have confirmed it." Another wave of excited murmuring. 4 months was well past the danger of early miscarriage. This was real. This was happening. "This is joyous news," the Queen Dowager announced, and the court erupted into congratulations that HWA Yon accepted with a serene smile and steady eyes. She didn't look at the Crown Prince again. She didn't need to. She could feel his gaze on her like heat from a flame, sharp and uncomfortable, full of questions he couldn't ask in public. Later, she thought. Ask me later. She had answers prepared for every question he might think of. He came to her chambers that night, not with the grim, duty-bound energy of their previous encounters. He came quickly, almost aggressively, and when he stepped inside the room, he didn't bother with preamble. "For months," he said. "Yes, the physicians have confirmed it. You can speak with them yourself if you doubt me." Jinhyun paced the length of the room, something she had never seen him do. He was always so controlled, so still, but this had broken through whatever careful composure he maintained. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" he demanded. HWA Yon looked up from the embroidery she had been pretending to work on, setting it aside with deliberate calm. "Tell you what exactly? That I might be pregnant, and have you dismiss it as manipulation, or tell you too early and risk the court knowing before the pregnancy was secure?" She tilted her head. "Or perhaps I should have come to you crying and uncertain, giving you the option to deny it was yours." The words landed precisely where she'd aimed them. His jaw tightened. "It is mine," he said. But the phrasing was uncertain, almost a question. "Timing is yours," HWA Yon confirmed. "Unless you believe I've been secretly entertaining other men inside the palace walls that you control, with the guards you command and the servants who report to your household." She let that sit for a moment. But of course, if you'd like to suggest that publicly, that's your prerogative. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder of reality. If he denied the child, he would have to explain how. And that explanation would be far more damaging than accepting paternity. Jinhyun stopped packing. He stood in the middle of the room, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. She searched her memories of the first timeline and couldn't find it there either. It was something like grudging respect. "You planned this," he said. "I fulfilled my duty to provide the succession," Hwa Yeon replied evenly, "which was, as I understood it, the primary expectation of my position. You announced it publicly before telling me privately, because a private conversation between us could be denied or delayed. A public announcement before the entire court cannot." She held his gaze. "I told you before our wedding night that I understand my position. The crown princess's power, limited as it is, derives from one thing, the heir she carries. I have secured that power. That was strategic, not deceptive." Jinhyun stared at her for a long time. "Not the woman I thought you were when we married," he said finally. "No," Hwa Yeon agreed. "I'm not." He left without another word, but at the door he paused, his hand on the frame, his back to her. "The child will want for nothing," he said quietly. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't love. But it was acknowledgement. And from him, in this moment, it was enough. The door closed. Hwa Yeon set down her embroidery and pressed both hands to her belly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to the life growing inside her. "You'll want for nothing. Your father's first promise to you, and it was a practical one, very fitting." She felt the flutter respond, and for the first time in what felt like years, she smiled without calculation. Just a real, quiet, private smile in an empty room. She was going to raise kings. The pregnancy changed everything in the palace. Hwa Yeon had anticipated many of the changes. The increased respect from court officials, who now had reason to take her seriously. The gifts from ministers eager to curry favor with the future mother of the heir. The official protective protocols that made it significantly harder for anyone to harm her. What she hadn't fully anticipated was Lady Min. In the first timeline, Lady Min had moved against her with calculated cruelty after the rejection. But now, with the pregnancy announced and the court buzzing with excitement, Lady Min's hatred became something more volatile, more desperate, because Lady Min understood what Hwa Yeon's pregnancy meant. If Hwa Yeon bore a son, that son would be crown prince, the heir, the future king, and Lady Min, no matter how much the crown prince loved her, could never give him a legitimate heir. Her children would always be concubine-born, secondary, contestable. The child in Hwa Yeon's belly was already more powerful than anything Lady Min could ever produce, and Lady Min knew it. The first attempt came 3 weeks after the pregnancy announcement. A jar of preserved plums delivered to Hwa Yeon's chambers as a gift from a minor court lady. Miran, who had been briefed to check every food gift, had it tested quietly by an apothecary connected to Jinho's network. The plums contained a herb that induced miscarriage in pregnant women. Hwa Yeon had the court lady who delivered them quietly investigated. The trail led to one of Lady Min's personal attendants. The connection was not quite direct enough for an accusation, but it was close enough for a warning. She sent Lady Min a gift in return. A beautiful bouquet of white chrysanthemums, the flower traditionally associated with death and funerals in Korean culture. No note. No explanation, just the flowers. Lady Min would understand the message. "I know, I see you. Try again and I'll bury you with evidence." The second attempt came 6 weeks later. A heated argument between 2 servants near Hwa Yeon's quarters, staged with suspicious precision to create a physical disturbance that might cause her to fall in the corridor. Miran had been warned and guided Hwa Yeon around the confrontation before it reached her. The third attempt was more sophisticated. A royal physician who appeared one afternoon claiming the Queen Dowager had requested a routine check on the pregnancy. The physician, whose credentials were real but whose loyalty was not, carried needles that Hwa Yeon's apothecary contact had identified as designed to stimulate premature labor. Hwa Yeon had him arrested before he could complete the examination. Not publicly. Just quietly, efficiently removed and delivered to the head of the palace guard with a sealed letter explaining the situation. When word reached Lady Min that her physician had been intercepted, the response was silence. Silence was more dangerous than action. It meant regrouping. HWA Yon doubled her security protocols and waited. If you're still watching, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button, not because I'm asking nicely. Because HWA Yon just survived 3 assassination attempts on her unborn children, and she deserves a standing ovation. If this woman existed, we'd be building statues of her. Comment below. Protect the BABIES if you're furious about those attempts. And keep watching, because what Lady Min does next is the reason this story exists. The Crown Prince heard about the physician. HWA Yon hadn't intended to tell him. She had handled the situation precisely and quietly, exactly as she preferred to handle most things. But the head of the palace guard, whose loyalty ran to the Crown Prince before anyone else, had reported the incident. Jinhyun arrived at her chambers in the evening with a controlled fury that was different from his usual cold distance. This was personal anger, the kind that comes when something you didn't realize you cared about is threatened. Physician, he said. Tell me everything. HWA Yon told him, calmly, factually, without editorializing or making accusations she couldn't prove. When she finished, the silence in the room was heavy. You have suspicions about who arranged this, Jinhyun said. It wasn't a question. Have no proof, HWA Yon replied carefully. I would not make an accusation without proof. That's not what I asked. She met his eyes. Suspicions without proof are politics, Your Highness. I'm not playing politics tonight. He looked at her for a long moment. You're protecting someone. I'm protecting myself. An accusation I can't prove will be turned against me. I know how this palace works. Jinhyun ran a hand through his hair, a rare loss of composure. Someone tried to harm my child. The possessive came naturally, HWA Yon noticed. My child, not the heir, not the succession, my child. Yes, she said simply. And you handled it alone without telling me? I handled it effectively. The physician is detained. The threat is neutralized. What would involving you have achieved beyond creating a confrontation I wasn't ready to control? He looked almost offended. I'm your husband, the child's father. I should have been told. You should have been told, HWA Yon agreed, and she let the slight emphasis on the word carry its own meaning. In the future, I'll inform you immediately. She watched him process this, watched him realize she was right, that she had handled it better alone than he would have handled it emotionally, and watched him resist acknowledging that. Are you unharmed? He asked finally, completely. The pregnancy is progressing exactly as it should. She paused. The child is strong. Something shifted in his expression. Brief and unguarded, gone almost before it appeared. A vulnerability she had never seen in him before. Children, he said suddenly. You said children at the announcement. I said child, HWA Yon corrected smoothly. Physicians said multiple heartbeats, he said carefully. I had them examined after the announcement. There's more than one. HWA Yon had been expecting this moment. She had prepared for it. And still the confirmation that he knew that the secret of the triplets was already partially uncovered sent a cold thread of calculation through her mind. She kept her face perfectly neutral. Physicians are thorough, she said. I was going to tell you when I was certain. You certain now? A beat of silence. Then, yes, there are 3. The number hit him like a physical blow. 3 children, 3 heirs. In one night the entire landscape of the succession had changed. Not just one heir to secure the throne, but 3 children to carry the royal line forward. 3 futures bound up in the woman sitting calmly in front of him. 3, Jinhyun repeated. Yes, that's. He sat down heavily in the chair near the window. The Crown Prince, always so rigidly composed, sat like a man whose legs had stopped working. That's extraordinary. HWA Yon said again. He looked at her with an expression she catalogued carefully. It was complicated. Multiple things layered over each other. Shock. A complicated kind of awe. The dawning calculation of a political mind understanding the implications. And underneath all of that, buried and reluctant and clearly unwelcome to him, the beginning of something that wasn't quite respect but was certainly moving in that direction. Known, he said slowly. For how long have you known there were 3? Since the physicians confirmed it, 3 months ago. You've been carrying 3 children alone for 3 months. Been carrying 3 children with Miran's support, HWA Yon corrected. I'm never entirely alone. Jinhyun looked at the door behind which Miran's room sat, then back at HWA Yon, then at his own hands resting on his knees. I don't know what to do with you, he said quietly, and it wasn't hostile. It was honest. Bewildered and honest in a way she had never heard from him before. She studied him. The crown prince in the candlelight, stripped of his performance of cold authority, genuinely uncertain for possibly the first time in his adult life. She thought about her first timeline, about dying, about the way he had knelt before her in her memories of the future that no longer existed, the future she was actively dismantling piece by piece. She thought about whether he deserved what was coming. And she decided the answer was still yes. "You don't have to do anything with me," she said softly. "I'm not asking you to change. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to let me be a good mother to these children. That's all." He said nothing, but he also didn't leave for almost an hour. He just sat in the chair by the window, quiet and unsettled, while Hwa returned to her embroidery and pretended she wasn't cataloging every micro-expression on his face. When he finally stood to go, he paused at the door again. "Assign additional guards," he said. "Personal protection. For you and the children." "Thank you, Your Highness." He left. Hwa set down her embroidery and stared at the closed door. She had expected the confrontation, had prepared for his anger or dismissal. What she had not expected was this strange, quiet evening where the crown prince had sat in her room for an hour saying almost nothing. It didn't change anything. He still loved Lady Min. He still didn't love her. The plan was still the plan, but she filed the evening away in her memory and tagged it with a word she hadn't associated with him before: human. He was, underneath all the ice and duty and trained coldness, occasionally and inconveniently human. She would need to be careful about that. The 6th month of pregnancy brought two things simultaneously. The children began to kick with enough force to be visible through the fabric of Hwa's robes, and the Queen Dowager summoned her for a private audience that had nothing to do with congratulations. The sitting room was the same as always. The Queen Dowager was the same as always. But her eyes held a different quality today, less triumphant, more watchful. "Children," the Queen Dowager said without preamble. "Yes, Your Majesty, that is unexpected. Children often are." The Queen Dowager's eyes narrowed slightly at the mild response. "The palace physicians say all three are strong, 2 boys and a girl. So they've told me as well. Male heirs and a princess." The Queen Dowager's tone was contemplative. "This changes the political landscape considerably." "I imagine it does, Your Majesty." The old woman rose from her seated position, something she rarely did, and walked slowly toward Hwa. She circled her with the calculating eye of someone assessing an investment. "When I chose you for the crown prince," she said quietly, "I expected obedience, a malleable girl who would do as she was told and be grateful for the position." "I know," Hwa said. "You are not that girl." "No, Your Majesty." Queen Dowager stopped in front of her. Up close, she was older than she appeared from a distance. The lines around her eyes were deep. Her hands, when she raised one to gesture, showed the slight tremor of age. She was old, Hwa realized. Not ancient, but aging. And aging powerful people became desperate in ways that made them more dangerous. "I want to understand your ambitions," the Queen Dowager said bluntly. Hwa met her eyes. "My ambitions are my children's futures, Your Majesty, nothing more." "Women say that. Few mean it." "I mean it. You've built financial connections outside the palace. I know about your merchant associate. I know about the trading interests." Hwa felt the ground shift slightly under her feet. The Queen Dowager had been watching more carefully than she'd realized. She kept her expression serene. "A wise woman secures her own stability. The palace provides my position, but positions change. I was simply ensuring that my children would never be without resources regardless of political circumstances." Queen Dowager studied her for a long moment. "You prepared for the possibility of being cast out," she said. "I prepared for reality," Hwa replied. "Reality has been unkind to crown princesses before me." The old woman made a sound that might have been a laugh, hard to tell. "You are nothing like I expected," she said, exactly as Jinhyun had said. "And I haven't decided yet whether that pleases me or frightens me." "Perhaps it doesn't have to be either," Hwa said carefully. "Perhaps we simply want the same things. Table succession, strong heirs, the royal line secured." "Want the same surface things," the Queen Dowager agreed. "It's the methodology where I suspect we might diverge." "Your Majesty is welcome to watch my methodology," Hwa said. "I have nothing to hide." That was a lie, of course. She had everything to hide. But it was a confident lie, and confidence was sometimes more convincing than truth. The Queen Dowager returned to her seat. "Go, rest. The children need their strength." "Your Majesty." At the door, the Queen Dowager's voice stopped her. "Princess," HWAON turned. "Woman who tried to harm your children," the Queen Dowager said, her eyes steady and revealing nothing. "She has been dealt with." A cold thread moved through HWAON's spine. "I don't know what you mean, Your Majesty." "Of course you don't." A thin smile. "Good night." HWAON walked out of the sitting room and down the corridor with measured steps, not allowing herself to rush until she was completely out of sight. The Queen Dowager had just told her, obliquely and deniably, that she had removed whoever had arranged the assassination attempts, which meant one of two things. Either the Queen Dowager was protecting HWAON and the heirs because she genuinely needed them for the succession, or the Queen Dowager had removed Lady Min's asset because she was building her own plan to use the children, and she didn't want outside interference complicating it. Both options were dangerous, and both confirmed what HWAON had always known. No one in this palace was her ally. Everyone was just calculating the usefulness of her children. That was fine. HWAON was calculating too. The birth happened on a night in late autumn when the wind came down from the northern mountains and set every lantern in the palace swaying. HWAON had prepared for this with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. She had 2 royal physicians she trusted, vetted through her network. She had Miran and 2 additional maids who had been trained in birthing emergencies. She had medicines, supplies, everything she might need. She had also, 3 weeks before her due date, quietly dispatched letters to Jinho with specific instructions for what to do if anything went wrong, because she had died in childbirth once before, and she was not going to die this time. The labor began before dawn and was, as triplet births tend to be, both extraordinary and brutal. HWAON had the memory of her first birth to orient her, but memory doesn't dull pain. It was still hours of work that made her understand why women sometimes didn't survive this. But she had promised herself. She was not going to die on this table. She was not going to leave these children, not this time. The first baby arrived at mid-morning. A boy. He came into the world screaming, which made the physicians exhale and Miran burst into tears. He was red-faced and furious and absolutely perfect. HWAON looked at him through blurred vision and felt the overwhelming, obliterating love that she had only felt once before, for only moments before dying. Jian, her strategist. Her firstborn. The second baby arrived 40 minutes later. Another boy, quieter than his brother, with wide dark eyes that seemed to look around the room with genuine curiosity the moment he emerged. As if he was already studying the world, Minyu, her scholar. Her gentle one. The third, the smallest, the most difficult. She arrived as the sun was setting, as the autumn wind outside hit its peak and every candle in the room flickered wildly. She came fighting, as if even being born was a battle she intended to win. The physicians were concerned for a moment. She was smaller than her brothers, and the silence before her cry felt infinite. Then she screamed, high and clear and absolutely furious at being made to wait. Saren, her warrior. Her heart. HWAON lay back against the pillows with all 3 of them arranged on her chest, their tiny bodies rising and falling with the impossible miracle of breath, and she wept. She wept for the first time since she had been reborn, not from grief, not from pain. From something she hadn't let herself feel in years, something she had buried under strategy and planning and cold calculation. She wept from love, pure and devastating and without agenda. Miran was beside her, also crying, holding HWAON's hand in both of hers. "They're beautiful," Miran whispered. "My lady, they're perfect." "I know," HWAON managed. "I know." She looked at each face in turn. Jian, who had his grandfather's broad forehead. Minyu, whose nose was slightly upturned in a way that made him look perpetually curious. Saren, so small and so fierce, already gripping HWAON's finger with a strength that was disproportionate to her size. "I'm going to protect you," HWAON told them quietly. The room was too full of people for this to be private, but she said it anyway. "I'm going to teach you everything. I'm going to make you so strong that nothing in this world can break you." She pressed her lips to each tiny forehead in turn. "This time," she whispered, "nobody dies." Crown Prince was informed at sunset. He arrived at the door of the birthing chamber as the physicians were clearing away, and HWAON was being made comfortable with all 3 bobbies beside her in a specially constructed cradle. Jinhyun stepped inside. He was still in his official robes from what must have been a court session. He looked like he'd been told the news and walked directly here, which was probably the case. He stood at the threshold and looked at the cradle. 3 bobbies. 2 boys and a girl. His face did something extraordinary. The ice cracked, not completely, not dramatically, just a hairline fracture in the surface barely visible. But H.W.A. Yohn, who had been studying his face for years across 2 lifetimes, saw it clearly. 3, he said, his voice strange. 3, H.W.A. Yohn confirmed. She was exhausted, bone-deep and absolute, but she kept her eyes open and her voice steady. He walked slowly to the cradle. He looked down at his children with the expression of a man encountering something that his entire framework for understanding the world had failed to prepare him for. He reached down. His hand hovered over the cradle for a moment, hesitating with an uncertainty she had never seen in him before. Then he gently touched the side of Jayan's face with one finger. A feather-light touch, as if he was afraid to break something. Jayan, who was already proving his future temperament by sleeping through every disturbance that had woken his siblings, didn't stir. Jinhyun looked at Minyu, whose wide eyes were open and directed with uncanny focus at the lantern above. Then at Saren, who was gripping the edge of her blanket with her fists and watching everything with suspicious intensity. "Girl looks angry," he said. "She came out fighting," H.W.A. Yohn said. "I think she'll always be that way." A brief, involuntary sound from Jinhyun that might have been a laugh. He straightened and looked at H.W.A. Yohn with those complicated eyes. "You did well," he said. It was not exactly warm. It was not a love confession or an apology for everything that had come before. But it was genuine, and coming from him, it landed differently than she expected. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, his composure mostly reassembled. "Rest. I'll have the physicians check on you tonight." He left. Miran appeared at H.W.A. Yohn's side the moment the door closed. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes were asking questions she knew better than to voice. H.W.A. Yohn looked at the door through which Jinhyun had just exited. "Read into it," she said quietly. "I didn't say anything, my lady. You were thinking very loudly." Miran handed her a cup of warm medicinal tea. "How do you feel?" H.W.A. Yohn accepted the tea and looked at her 3 sleeping children. How did she feel? She felt like a woman who had died once and refused to die again. She felt like someone standing at the beginning of a very long war who had just secured her first and most important weapon. She felt like a mother. And in this palace, full of vipers and schemes and cold political calculations, being a mother was both the most vulnerable and the most dangerous thing she could possibly be. She pressed her free hand to the edge of the cradle, where Saren's tiny fist was still clutching her blanket. "Feel ready," H.W.A. Yohn said. 10 years passed, not slowly, not quietly, not the way time passes when nothing is happening. They pass the way a river carves through stone, relentless, invisible in its daily motion. But at the end of 10 years, when you looked at what remained, you understood that something enormous had been accomplished. H.W.A. Yohn's children grew. Jayan first, always first, pushing ahead of his siblings by minutes at birth and by everything else as the years accumulated. He was 10 years old now, and already the kind of child that made adults uneasy in the way that only happens when a young person is demonstrably smarter than the people around them. He had his mother's dark eyes and her stillness, the quality of watching everything without appearing to watch anything. He could sit through an entire court gathering at his mother's side and afterward, in the carriage home, recite every whispered conversation he had overheard in perfect order. H.W.A. Yohn had started teaching him strategy when he was 5. Not the polite court version of strategy, all careful language and diplomatic euphemism, but real strategy. The kind that included understanding your enemy's weaknesses before they understood yours. She used a Waiki board, the ancient game of territory and influence, and she taught him the way her own mind worked. Not move by move, but pattern by pattern. Not what your opponent did last turn, but what they were setting up 4 turns from now. By the time Jayan was 8, he was beating her. By the time he was 9, he was beating her so badly that H.W.A. Yohn found herself genuinely working to keep up. By 10, she stopped playing against him altogether and started simply watching him think. "You see the whole board," she told him once, watching him study a mid-game position she had set up. "Most people see their pieces. You see the spaces between them." Jayan had looked up at her with those still, serious eyes. "The spaces are more important than the pieces. You can always get more pieces. You can never get back space that's been taken." H.W.A. Yohn had felt something move in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly, but also a faint, uncomfortable recognition. She had made him this way. She had deliberately shaped him into a weapon. She just hadn't anticipated that the weapon would have his own ideas about how to be used. Minyu was different from his brother in almost every way. Where Jian was still, Minyu was motion. Where Jian spoke rarely and precisely, Minyu talked constantly and joyfully, with the enthusiasm of someone who found every piece of information equally fascinating and couldn't understand why the entire world wasn't equally excited. He had developed an obsession with medicine at age 4 when HWA Yon had allowed one of her trusted physicians to treat a minor injury in front of him. While most 4-year-olds would have cried at the sight of needles and medicinal pastes, Minyu had leaned forward with wide, delighted eyes and asked 17 questions without stopping. The physician had looked at HWA Yon with an expression of helpless admiration. By 7, Minyu could identify and name over 100 medicinal herbs from memory. By 9, he was helping the physician prepare simple remedies. By 10, he was asking questions that the physician sometimes couldn't answer, which seemed to delight Minyu rather than frustrate him. Unknown things are the most interesting, he told HWA Yon with cheerful certainty. If we already knew everything, what would be left to figure out? He was kind in a way that made HWA Yon's heart ache sometimes, because she knew how dangerous kindness was in the palace. He would stop to help injured animals. He remembered the names and families of every servant who worked in their household. He cried at sad stories and felt no apparent embarrassment about it. She taught him that his kindness was not weakness. She taught him that understanding how people felt was just as strategic as understanding how they thought. She taught him to be kind and observant simultaneously, to let his warmth be the door through which information walked willingly. People tell kind people things they'd never tell clever ones, she told him. Be both, and nothing will stay hidden from you. Minho had thought about this with his characteristic openness. That sounds a little like manipulation, he said. It is, HWA Yon agreed. The question is what you do with what you learn. He'd thought about that too. I suppose if you use it to help people, it's medicine. If you use it to hurt them, it's poison. Exactly. What do you use it for, Mother? HWA Yon had looked at her second-born son with his father's nose and her grandmother's eyes, and she had said, survival, which is sometimes just a slower kind of both. Minho had accepted this with the particular wisdom of a 10-year-old who understood that adults were complicated and decided to love them anyway. And then there was Saren. Saren, who at 4 had decided she was bored with embroidery and asked why boys got to practice sword forms in the courtyard while girls had to sit inside and stitch flowers. Saren, who at 6 had stolen her brother Jian's practice sword while he was sleeping and taught herself the first 3 forms by watching the guards from her window every morning for a month. Saren, who at 8 had beaten the guard assigned to protect them in a practice match using a wooden sword, and when the guard had stared at her in stunned silence, had asked very politely if they could go again because she wanted to see if she could do it faster. Saren was small. Of the 3 triplets, she was the smallest, and it was clear she would never be particularly tall. She had HWA Yon's bone structure and her grandmother's coloring, dark and fine-featured. But she moved through the world with a physical confidence that made her seem to take up exactly as much space as she chose, regardless of her actual dimensions. She was also, of all 3 children, the most emotionally perceptive. Jian saw patterns in situations. Minyu understood what people felt, but Saren understood why people made the choices they did, often before the people themselves understood it. She had a terrifying clarity about human motivation that cut through pretense and politeness like her practice sword cut air. She had looked at HWA Yon once, at age 9, with those direct, unflinching eyes and said, "You're angry at Father, aren't you? You're always polite to him, but your hands go still when he comes into the room. You only go still like that when you're angry." HWA Yon had been deeply, genuinely shocked. She had thought her composure was perfect. "Why do you think I'm angry?" she had asked carefully. Saren had shrugged with the elegant carelessness of someone who had already figured something out and was just waiting for the adults to confirm it. "Because he was unkind to you before we were born. I don't know exactly what happened, but I know that's what it is." After that conversation, HWA Yon had accelerated Saren's combat training, found her the best swords instructor available through Jinho's connections, and also begun teaching her the thing that made sword skills genuinely dangerous: when to use them, and when a sharper weapon was available. Your body is a weapon, HWAON told her, but your mind is the hand that decides when and how to use it. A sword in a fool's hand is theater. A sword in a strategist's hand is a message. Saren had considered this. What kind of message? That depends entirely on who you want to send it to. Saren had grinned, sharp and bright and slightly feral. I want to send it to anyone who thinks small means weak. Then practice, HWAON said she had. Comment right now if you have a favorite child so far. Is it Jian the strategist who can see 4 moves ahead? Minyu the healer who uses kindness as intelligence? Or Saren the warrior who sees through every lie? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Because the way this story goes, each child is going to be important in ways that will surprise you, like if you're proud of these children already. They haven't even started their part of the story yet. The palace during these 10 years was not unchanged. The crown prince was now the king. The old king, Jinhyun's father, had died in the 5th year after the triplets were born. A slow illness that the physicians had tried unsuccessfully to treat. Minyu, who had been 5 years old and already possessed of an unusual medical mind, had asked to see the physician's notes and spent a week reading them with a focus that was both impressive and slightly eerie in a 5-year-old. They were treating the symptoms, he had told HWAON afterward, but not the root. If they'd addressed the root earlier, he might have had 3 more years. HWAON had looked at her 5-year-old son and felt the particular vertigo that his mind regularly induced. Do you know this? She had asked. Because the symptoms were all downstream of the same source, like a river that floods its tributaries because the main channel is blocked. You can drain the tributaries all you want, but until you unblock the channel. He had trailed off with a slight frown. I wish I'd been allowed to look at him earlier. Jinhyun had become king at 29. The coronation had been magnificent and cold, as befitting the man. He had taken the throne with the same expression he took everything, like a duty he would fulfill perfectly and find no joy in. HWAON had stood at his side through the ceremony as queen consort, dressed in gold and deep blue, their 3 children arrayed beside them in formal robes. Jian, grave and still, had been formally designated crown prince the following month. Succession was, officially, secured. The Queen Dowager had watched everything from her elevated position with the expression of someone who had successfully moved all the pieces to where she wanted them, and was beginning the satisfied phase of assuming she had won. HWAON had watched the Queen Dowager back, because she knew better. Lady Min's situation had changed dramatically in those 10 years. In the early years, Lady Min had continued her attempts to undermine HWAON, subtler than before. More careful, but persistent, HWAON had deflected each attempt with the patience of someone who had been expecting them. She documented everything. Every agent Lady Min sent, every bribe, every whispered campaign to damage HWAON's reputation among the courtiers. She kept it all. Every piece of evidence, carefully preserved and stored in a location that only she and Miran knew about, not to use yet, but to have. Because the time to use evidence was not immediately after gathering it. The time to use evidence was when using it would cause maximum damage to the right people. And HWAON was exceptionally patient. What she hadn't anticipated was that Lady Min would eventually damage herself. In the 7th year after the triplets were born, Lady Min had made a decision driven by desperation that HWAON recognized immediately as fatal. She had approached Prince Yeonsan. Yeonsan, exiled on his country estate with his fake illness, and his signed confession safely in HWAON's possession, had apparently been convinced by Lady Min's promises of power and relevance to make certain claims. Specifically, Lady Min had arranged for Yeonsan to begin quietly, deniably spreading a rumor that the triplets were not the king's children, that they had been conceived through treachery, that the succession itself was fraudulent. It was, HWAON had to admit privately, an elegant attack. It struck at the one vulnerability she couldn't fully defend. The truth. The triplets were biologically Yeonsan's. If that could be proven, or even credibly suggested, the entire edifice of what she had built would crack. Lady Min had found the one thread she could pull. The problem was that she had pulled it without knowing HWAON had spent a decade preparing for exactly this moment. HWA Yon had learned about Lady Min's approach to Yonsen within 3 days of it happening. Her informants in the country had been watching Yonsen since the day she'd exiled him. Every visitor, every letter, every unusual movement had been recorded and reported. She had sat with the information for 1 week, just letting it sit. Letting Lady Min believe the plan was proceeding undetected. Letting Yonsen believe he had found an ally. Then she acted. First, she sent a message to Yonsen. Brief. 6 words. Remember what I hold about you. Yonsen's cooperation with Lady Min stopped overnight. The man who had signed a full confession of his role in a conspiracy against the crown princess, who had agreed to exile in exchange for his life, understood immediately that he had made a catastrophic error in trusting Lady Min's promises over HWA Yon's documented threat. He sent back a frantic letter begging for mercy. HWA Yon didn't respond. She didn't need to. His silence was enough. Second, she went to the king. Not with accusations, not with the documents she had spent a decade accumulating. Just with information, delivered with the calm precision of someone who had carefully selected exactly what to reveal and exactly what to hold back. Your Majesty, she said, in the private study where they occasionally met for the formal briefings that their arrangement included. There are rumors moving through the court about the succession. I thought you should know. Jin Hyun had looked up from the administrative documents that perpetually covered his desk. What rumors? That the children's legitimacy is being questioned. The source appears to be Lady Min. She paused. She has approached Prince Yonsen. His face went very still. Tell me, he said quietly. She told him. Not everything. Not the truth about the conception, obviously, but the facts about Lady Min's recent campaign, about Yonsen's involvement, about the nature of the rumor being spread. When she finished, the silence in the study was absolute. You have documentation? He asked. I have letters, testimonies from intermediaries, and a record of movements that establishes the connection clearly. She set a sealed folder on his desk. I've had this prepared for some time. I was hoping it wouldn't be necessary. Jin Hyun looked at the folder, then at her. How long have you known about this? About this specific campaign? 10 days. About Lady Min's ongoing efforts to undermine the succession, since the 3rd month after the children were born. Implications of that statement landed visibly on his face. 10 days for this, 7 years for the rest. Been watching her for 7 years, he said. Been protecting our children for 7 years, HWA Yon corrected gently. That's not the same thing. Didn't you come to me sooner? Because until she attacked the succession directly, everything she did was personal. Attempts to damage my reputation, my position. I handled those myself. They were my problem. HWA Yon met his eyes steadily. When she moved against the children's legitimacy, it became your problem too. Jin Hyun opened the folder. He read in silence for several minutes. HWA Yon watched his face and saw the progression. Clinical reading, recognition of what he was looking at, a deepening stillness that in a less controlled man would have been fury. She arranged the physician, he said, not a question. He was reading a document she had included about the assassination attempts in the early pregnancy period. I didn't want to burden you with it at the time, HWA Yon said. The threat had been neutralized. He looked up at her sharply. 3 attempts on your life while you were carrying my children, and you decided not to burden me. Decided to handle it. HWA Yon. It was the first time in 10 years of marriage that he had used her name without a title, just her name. Plain and direct and carrying a weight she wasn't entirely prepared for, she kept her expression neutral. The children are safe. They've always been safe. That's what matters. What matters, he said, his voice carefully controlled, is that my wife has apparently been fighting a covert war inside my palace for 10 years without my knowledge. You knew what you wanted to know, HWA Yon said, and she let the mild truth of that carry itself. Another silence. Jin Hyun set down the folder. He looked at the documents. He looked at his hands. He looked at the wall. I have been, he said slowly, a poor husband. Of all the things she had prepared for this conversation, that was not among them. She said nothing. Gave him no response to work with, no reassurance to grab onto. I know that's not a revelation, he continued, still looking at the wall. And I'm not saying it to request forgiveness. I'm saying it because looking at this, he gestured at the folder, it becomes clear that while I was managing the kingdom, you were managing everything else, including threats I should have been managing. You had a kingdom to run, HWA Yon said carefully. I had a family that was under attack, he replied. Those are not mutually exclusive responsibilities. She studied him with the objective eye she had trained on him for a decade. Something was different today. He had been changing incrementally for years. She had noticed it. Small thaws, brief moments of genuine engagement with her and the children, the occasional evening where he stayed in the family quarters longer than duty required. She had documented those too, not as evidence of anything, just as data. Data about the slow, inconvenient humanity of a man she had spent 2 lifetimes preparing to destroy. "What will you do about Lady Min?" she asked, steering back toward the practical. Jin Hyun looked at the folder again. "What I should have done a long time ago," he said. Lady Min was removed from the palace 3 days later, not executed, not publicly disgraced, just quietly, efficiently transferred to a temple residence in the mountains, the traditional destination for palace women who needed to be permanently absent from the capital. She went without making a scene, which surprised many of the courtiers who had been expecting drama. But HWA Yeon understood why. Lady Min had seen the documents. She knew how comprehensively she had been documented over the years. A scene would only accelerate consequences she was trying to minimize. She had lost. She knew it. She went. The Queen Dowager watched Lady Min's departure with an expression that HWA Yeon interpreted as satisfied. One more variable removed. One more piece of the board controlled. HWA Yeon watched the Queen Dowager watching, and felt the particular alertness of someone who has neutralized one threat and immediately begun calculating the next. Lady Min was gone. Good, but the Queen Dowager was still here. And the Queen Dowager was smarter than Lady Min had ever been. Miran found HWA Yeon in the children's study late that evening. It was a room HWA Yeon had insisted on creating in their palace quarters. Not a formal schoolroom with a rigid tutor and traditional texts. A real study, with maps on the walls and books stacked everywhere, and a large central table covered in whatever project the children were currently working on. Tonight, the table held Jayan's Waiki board with a game in progress, a half-finished anatomical diagram that Minyu had been working on, and Saren's practice schedule written in her characteristic decisive handwriting with aggressive annotations about which guards she thought could still improve their form. HWA Yeon stood in the doorway of the empty room, looking at the evidence of her children's minds laid out across the table, and felt the weight of 10 years settle over her like a cloak. "My lady," Miran said softly from behind her, "he's dismissed Lady Min. I know, you well." HWA Yeon walked slowly into the room. She sat at the table, in the chair she usually occupied when she tutored Jayan, and looked at the Waiki board. The game in progress was complex mid-stage with territory contested on 3 fronts simultaneously. She picked up a black stone and held it. "Been planning his destruction for over a decade," she said quietly. Miran sat across from her. "Yes." Lady Min is gone. The Queen Dowager is isolated. The children are being raised into exactly who they need to be. The financial network is established. The alliances are in place. She turned the stone over in her fingers. "Everything is proceeding exactly as I planned," Miran said again, waiting. HWA Yeon set the stone down on the board. A careful, deliberate placement. "He said he'd been a poor husband," she said. Miran was quiet for a moment. "What did you say back?" "Nothing. Nothing." I changed the subject. There was nothing useful to say. HWA Yeon looked at the stone she'd placed. "He means it, that's the problem. If he'd said it as politics, as a calculation to soften me, I'd know how to respond, but he meant it." "My lady," Miran said gently. "Is it possible that he's changing?" HWA Yeon looked up from the board. "People don't change, Miran, they reveal." "What's he revealing?" A long pause. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the palace grounds, carrying the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. "That he's capable of more than I gave him credit for," HWA Yeon said, "which makes him more dangerous, not less." Or, Miran offered carefully, "It makes your plan more complicated." "Plans should be complicated," HWA Yeon said. "Simple plans break on the first contact with reality." But she kept the Waiki stone in her hand. And she sat at the table for a long time after Miran left, looking at the evidence of the children she had built, thinking about the man who had called her by her name. "If you're still watching, I want to ask you something directly. Do you think she should soften? Do you think 10 years of building and planning and protecting should be enough? And maybe now she should let herself feel something that isn't strategy? Comment yes if you think she should let her guard down." Comment no if you think she needs to stay cold. I genuinely want to know what you think, because the next section of this story hinges on exactly that question. And HWA Yone's answer might not be the one you expect, like this video if you're still here. Every like tells me you're invested. And the number of people invested in this story is what keeps me telling it. The king began to change. HWA Yone documented it the same way she documented everything. Objectively, methodically, with the clinical detachment of someone recording data rather than experiencing it. He began eating dinner with the family, not every night. 2-3 times a week. He would arrive in the family quarters after his evening administrative sessions, and he would sit at the table with the children, and he would ask them questions about their studies with the careful manner of someone learning how to be in a space where they had not previously belonged. The children adapted to this with their characteristic individual approaches. Jayan watched his father with the same careful assessment he brought to everything. He answered questions directly and without elaboration, offering nothing more than what was asked, but also nothing less. He was neither warm nor hostile, just precise. Minyu was immediately, unreservedly delighted. He had inherited no particular grudge, having been too young to know there was one to have, and he treated his father's presence at dinner the way he treated every new phenomenon, as an opportunity to learn something interesting. He asked Jinhyun questions about governance and warfare and court history with the same insatiable curiosity he brought to medicine, and Jinhyun, to his credit, answered them fully. He knows a great deal about military logistics, Minyu reported to HWA Yone after one such dinner, with the tone of someone sharing a surprising and impressive discovery. He said the army's supply chains are the most important and least glamorous part of any campaign. Most generals care about tactics, but the ones who win are the ones who make sure everyone has food. That's accurate, HWA Yone had said. Did you know that already? Yes, Minho had looked at her with those wide, thoughtful eyes. Did you teach him that, or did he figure it out himself? HWA Yone had paused. He figured it out himself. Minho had nodded, processing this with visible satisfaction. Good. I was afraid everything smart about him was from you. It's better if he has some of his own. HWA Yone had not known quite what to do with that, so she had said nothing. Saren's approach to her father's reemergence was the most direct and most characteristic. She had waited until the third dinner he attended, and then, without preamble or build-up, had looked at him across the table and said, "Why didn't you eat with us before?" The table had gone quiet. Jinhyun had looked at his daughter, at her direct eyes and her uncompromising expression. He had looked like a man confronting a question he had been hopping to avoid indefinitely. "I was busy," he had said. "A king," Saren had replied. "You're always busy, that's not a reason." Another silence. Jinhyun had looked at HWA Yone with an expression that asked for help she deliberately did not provide. "Right," he had said finally to Saren. "It's not a reason, it's an excuse." Saren had considered this. "Are you going to keep coming to dinner now?" "Yes." "Then it doesn't matter as much why you didn't before." She had picked up her chopsticks and resumed eating with the air of someone who had resolved the matter satisfactorily and was ready to move on. Jinhyun had looked at HWA Yone again. This time his expression was something she couldn't quite categorize. Bewildered. Moved. Slightly undone. HWA Yone had looked back at him with the same neutral composure she always maintained. But that night, alone in her room, she had taken out her notes and added a single line under the section she had labeled with his name. He accepted accountability without excuses. He did not deflect. She had stared at that line for a while. Then she had closed the notebook. The Queen Dowager became ill in the 9th year. It started as a cough that the royal physicians treated with routine medicine. Then it became a deeper thing, a rattling in her chest that didn't respond to treatment, a fatigue that the old woman fought with visible fury, as if her body's weakness was a personal insult. She was not dying. Not yet. But she was diminished, and diminished people became either resigned or desperate, and the Queen Dowager had never been resigned to anything in her life. She summoned HWA Yone 3 times in the space of 2 months. The first meeting was a fishing expedition. The Queen Dowager, from her sick bed, asked oblique questions about the children's education, their temperaments, their relationships with their father. HWA Yone answered everything with the pleasant transparency of someone who had nothing to hide, which was the most effective way to hide everything. The second meeting was more direct. The Queen Dowager, propped on elaborate pillows and looking smaller than H.W.A. Yon had ever seen her, asked plainly, "What do you want?" H.W.A. Yon had looked at the old woman for a moment, at the face that had orchestrated so much of her suffering, at the hands that had sent guards to throw her off a cliff in another life. "Want my children's futures secured," she had answered. "I want the succession stable. I want the kingdom well governed." "Pretty answers," the Queen Dowager had said. "What do you actually want?" H.W.A. Yon had smiled. "Those are actually what I want, Your Majesty. My children are the kingdom's future. Their success is my success. Their power is my power." "You've become very wise," the Queen Dowager said, and it sounded like an accusation. "Had good teachers," H.W.A. Yon replied. "Adversity is the best one." The third meeting happened at dawn on a day when the autumn cold was sharp enough to feel dangerous. The Queen Dowager had summoned her urgently, and H.W.A. Yon had arrived to find the old woman more alert than she had been in months, alert and frightened. "Someone tried to poison me last night," the Queen Dowager said. H.W.A. Yon's expression didn't change. "Do you know who?" "I have suspicions." The Queen Dowager's eyes were fixed on her. "You've been building power for a decade. You have resources, allies, networks I can only partially map. You have reason to hate me." "Do," H.W.A. Yon agreed. The Queen Dowager blinked. She had expected a denial. "You arranged for me to be thrown off a cliff," H.W.A. Yon said, her voice conversational and perfectly level. "You orchestrated my humiliation. You used my body as a political instrument. You tried to have my unborn children killed." She tilted her head. "Yes, I have reason to hate you, Your Majesty." The room was very quiet. "But I did not poison you," H.W.A. Yon continued. "And not because I lack the capability or the inclination, but because you dying now before I'm finished would complicate things considerably. The king would grieve in his way. The court would destabilize. My children would be pulled into succession politics at a critical age." She folded her hands in her lap. "Your continued existence for a little while longer is more useful to me than your death." Queen Dowager stared at her. "You are the most terrifying person in this palace," the old woman said finally. "No," H.W.A. Yon said. "I'm just the most prepared." "Tried to poison me, if not you." H.W.A. Yon had spent the past 12 hours investigating exactly that question. Lady Min had contacts who remained in the palace after her departure, she said. Loyalists, people who believed her promises of eventual return to power. She reached into her sleeve and produced a small sealed document. "This is their names, all 7 of them, and this is the evidence connecting them to last night's attempt." Queen Dowager took the document with hands that shook slightly, though whether from illness or emotion was unclear. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked. "Because they're your enemy, not mine," H.W.A. Yon said. "I have enough enemies of my own. I don't need to create new ones by letting you be killed by someone else's." She stood to leave. "Princess," the Queen Dowager said. H.W.A. Yon paused. "When this is over," the old woman said slowly, "when you've done whatever you've been planning all these years, what do you want from me?" H.W.A. Yon looked back at her over her shoulder, at the diminished, aging, still dangerous woman who had destroyed her first life and made her second one possible by that very destruction. "Want you to live long enough to see what I've built," H.W.A. Yon said quietly, "and to know that you could not have stopped it." She left. The children's 10th birthday celebration was held in the palace's main garden on a clear autumn afternoon. It was a formal occasion by necessity, with ministers and court officials in attendance to honor the crown prince and his siblings. But H.W.A. Yon had carved out the morning as a private family celebration before the official event. She had made the breakfast herself. Or more precisely, she had directed Miran in making it while contributing more than any crown queen was supposed to, which Miran had pretended not to notice. The children had woken early, all 3 of them unusually animated, the formal dignity they maintained in public contexts completely absent in the privacy of the family quarters. Jian had appeared in the kitchen doorway at dawn, wrapped in a sleeping robe, to inquire with studied casualness whether the dumpling filling included the specific combination of pork and mushroom he preferred. Minyu had arrived moments later to announce that he had been awake since the hour of the tiger, thinking about the fact that 10 was a significant number in several mathematical systems, and he had thoughts about that if anyone was interested. Saren had simply appeared already dressed at the training courtyard, visible through the window, practicing sword forms in the early light with the focused intensity she brought to her mornings. Hwa Yeon had stood in the kitchen doorway watching them. Her children, 10 years old, alive, healthy, brilliant in their individual and irreducible ways, she had died before meeting them in another life. Had held them for minutes before the cold took her. She had known them for 10 years now. And the love was so different from what she had felt in those final moments on the riverbank. That love had been desperate and pure, the love of someone losing something. This love was quieter, heavier, built from 10 years of mornings and arguments and lessons and dinners and watching them become themselves. It was the most dangerous thing she carried, because it was the one thing that could make her predictable. The king arrived for breakfast. Unannounced, which was unusual, in simple robes without the formal trappings of kingship, which was more unusual still. He had clearly made a deliberate choice to show up as a person rather than a monarch. The children received him accordingly. Jian moved over on the bench to make room without being asked, an act of wordless accommodation that was, from him, practically effusive. Minyu immediately launched into his thoughts about the mathematics of the number 10, addressing his father with the same unself-conscious directness he addressed everyone. Saren came in from the courtyard when Miran fetched her, still carrying her practice sword, and sat down with it propped against her knee, because she had decided it was unnecessary to put it away for breakfast. Jinhyun sat among his children and ate dumplings at a kitchen table, and listened to Minyu's mathematical theory with what appeared to be genuine interest, and occasionally looked across the table at Hwa Yeon with an expression she had been cataloging for 3 years without successfully nomming. After breakfast, after the children had scattered to prepare for the formal celebration, Jinhyun stayed at the table. Miran vanished with the practiced invisibility of someone who understood when she needed to not be present. Hwa Yeon cleared the remaining dishes with the efficient motion of habit, acutely aware of him behind her. Hwa Yeon, he said. She stopped, set down the bowl she was holding. Extraordinary, he said. The children, she agreed. You did that. Contributed equally to their existence. That's not what I mean. He paused. She heard him shift at the table. I mean who they are, what they know, how they think, how they treat people. That's you. That's 10 years of you. She turned to face him. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she couldn't name. Across the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the lattice windows without his crown or his formal robes or the political architecture of the court around him. I wasted the first years, he said. I know that. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. I'm not pretending anything, Hwa Yeon said carefully. No, you never do. He met her eyes. That's what I want to say. You've never pretended with me, not really. Even when it would have been safer or easier, you've always just told me the truth, even when the truth was a weapon. Hwa Yeon's hands were still at her sides. Her face was still. But inside, something shifted in a way she hadn't authorized it to shift. What are you saying? She asked. Saying, he stopped, looked at the table. Looked back at her with an expression that she finally, in this moment, recognized. Regret, not the political regret of a man acknowledging a strategic error. The other kind. The kind that lived in the body, that couldn't be reasoned away, that arrived too late and knew it. Saying, I see you, Jinhyun said quietly. I don't think I did before, but I see you now. Kitchen was very quiet. Hwa Yeon looked at the man who had rejected her in a bridal chamber 20 years ago in another life. Who had walked away from her in the snow. Who had unknowingly fathered 3 children he would have denied without her planning. Who had watched those children grow into extraordinary people, partly through his own gradual reemergence into their lives. She looked at him and felt the precise, surgical difficulty of being a person who had spent 20 years preparing to destroy someone and discovered, too late, that destruction was no longer the only option available. She said nothing, because she was not ready. Because nothing about this moment had been planned. Because Hwa Yeon, who had prepared for every eventuality, had not prepared for this one. She picked up the bowl she had set down. Formal celebration begins in 2 hours, she said. The children need to be dressed. She walked out of the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Jinhyun exhale slowly. She did not look back, but at the doorway she paused for just a moment, her hand on the frame, and said without turning, They are extraordinary. And so are you, when you choose to be. Then she left. And she didn't let herself think about what she'd said until she was alone in her room, with the door closed and Miran outside, and the sounds of the palace birthday celebration beginning to drift through the window. She sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands to her face. The plan. The plan was still the plan, wasn't it? The morning it all began to unravel started quietly. The most catastrophic mornings always do. HWA Yon was in her private study, a room she had claimed years ago and furnished with the accumulated tools of her double life. Maps of the kingdoms trade routes on one wall, genealogical charts of the major court families on another, a locked cabinet containing documents that could destroy half the people in the palace, a writing desk covered in correspondence from her merchant network, disguised as household accounts. She was reviewing the latest intelligence from Jinho's network when Jian knocked at the door. She knew it was him before he announced himself. He knocked the way he did everything, 3 precise raps, evenly spaced, announcing presence without demanding attention. "Come in," she said. He entered and closed the door behind him. He was 10 years old and he moved through doorways the way adults moved through doorways, with the controlled deliberateness of someone who had already learned that entrances mattered. He looked at the documents on her desk, then he looked at her. "You've been building something," he said. It was not a question. HWA Yon set down her brush. She had been preparing for this conversation for years, knowing it would come eventually, not knowing when. She had not expected it at 10. "Down," she said. He sat across from her, his posture straight but not rigid, and waited with the patience of a child who had been taught that silence was information too. HWA Yon looked at her son, her strategist, the child who could see 4 moves ahead on a Wiki board and had started applying that same vision to the world around him with increasing sophistication. She had taught him to see patterns. She couldn't be surprised when he saw hers. "What do you think I've been building?" she asked. Diane considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "Power," he said. "Independent of father, independent of the palace structure. You have money that isn't from the royal treasury. You have people who report to you rather than to the court. You have documents." He nodded at the locked cabinet with the perception of a child who had noticed every detail of this room over years of occasional visits, "that you keep separate from official records." "What do you conclude from that?" HWA Yon asked. "That you were afraid," he said quietly. "Not of specific things, of circumstances. You built this because you didn't trust that your position here was permanent. You needed to know that if everything changed, you and we would still be safe." She studied him for a long moment. "That's most of it," she said. "What's the rest?" She thought about how much to tell him. She had always known she would tell him eventually. The children were her weapons, yes, but she had never wanted them to be weapons who didn't understand what they were aimed at or why. She had seen too many people destroyed by being used without understanding it. She had decided, years ago, that when they were ready, she would tell them everything. She had not decided that 10 was ready. But Jian was looking at her with eyes that had already traveled further than 10 years should have taken them, and she understood that readiness, like most things, didn't arrive on schedule. "Jian," she said carefully, "I am going to tell you something that will change how you see everything in your life. And once I tell you, I can't untell you. Do you understand?" "Yes." "You certain you want to know?" He held her gaze. "I've wanted to know since I was 7, and I realized you were awake every night for an hour after you thought we were all asleep. Whatever keeps you awake at night is something I should understand." HWA Yon was quiet for a moment. Then she began. She told him about the first life. Not everything, not the biological truth of the conception, but the essential truth. That she had been married to his father, rejected, exiled, and killed. That she had been reborn with her memories intact. That the woman he knew as his mother was someone who had been destroyed once and rebuilt herself from nothing with the specific intention of ensuring it never happened again. She told him about the Queen Dowager's schemes, about Lady Min's attempts on their lives, about the years of building protection in the shadows while maintaining the perfect surface of the obedient crown princess. She told him about the children on the riverbank, how she had held them for minutes before dying, how that memory had been the foundation of everything she'd built in this life. Jian listened without interrupting. His face went through changes she watched carefully. Not shock, precisely. More like the expression of someone who has been given the final piece of a puzzle they've been studying for years and is now watching it complete itself. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "The documents in that cabinet," he said finally. "Yes, they're protection, but they're also weapons. Against the Queen Dowager, against anyone who tries to threaten us." "Yes." Jian looked at the locked cabinet for a long moment. Then he looked at his mother with eyes that were older than they had been at the start of the conversation. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. "At the end of all of this, what does success look like for you?" HWA Yon had asked herself this question many times. She had different answers at different points. In the early years, the answer had been simple and violent: destruction. Everyone who had hurt her brought to ruin, the crown prince on his knees, the Queen Dowager stripped of everything. But the answer had been changing. Quietly, without her permission, over years of dinners and lessons, and watching her children grow and watching the king change and sitting in kitchens on birthdays thinking things she hadn't planned to think. "I want us to be safe," she said, permanently, undeniably, beyond anyone's power to threaten. "Father," Jayan asked, a pause, "what about your father? He's part of this. He hurt you. In your first life, he destroyed you. What do you want for him?" HWA Yon looked at her son, at the precision of him, the refusal to allow sentimentality to obscure relevant questions. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That is the only part of the plan I haven't resolved." Jayan nodded slowly. "I think that's the most important part," he said. "Everything else you've built is structure. Money, alliances, documents, networks. Those are the board. But what you want for him is the game. And you can't win a game if you don't know what winning looks like." HWA Yon stared at her 10-year-old son and felt the profound and slightly unsettling experience of being told something true by someone she had taught to be truthful. "Right," she said. "I know," Jayan said, with the complete absence of arrogance that made it simply an acknowledgement of fact rather than pride. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to think about it," HWA Yon said. "Which is the honest answer?" Jayan stood. He bowed to her formally, which he did sometimes in private moments and which always moved her in ways she didn't examine too closely. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I'll keep it." "I know you will." He left. HWA Yon sat alone in her study for a long time after. Her son had asked her what winning looked like, and she had said she didn't know. That was the first time in 2 lifetimes that HWA Yon had said she didn't know about something that mattered. It was Saren who found the confession, 3 weeks after HWA Yon's conversation with Jayan. On a cold morning when the palace grounds were dusted with the first frost of winter, Saren went into her mother's study. She had not been given permission to do this. She had not asked for it. Saren operated on the general principle that permission was a formality for situations where the outcome was uncertain, and since she had already decided she was going in, permission was redundant. She was looking for a document she had seen her mother reference once, a record of the palace guard rotations that she wanted to study for training purposes. She knew where her mother kept administrative documents, in the 3rd drawer of the left-hand cabinet, organized by subject. She found the guard rotations. She also found, in the same drawer, a document that had been misfiled, or perhaps not misfiled. Perhaps simply placed adjacent to its correct location by a mother who had been tired or distracted or for once insufficiently precise. Saren read the document. She read it 3 times. Then she sat very still in her mother's chair for a long time. The document was Prince Yonson's signed confession. Saren understood what she was reading. She was 10 years old and she had been taught to understand complex things, and this was not actually complex. It was just devastating. She replaced the document exactly where she had found it. She replaced the guard rotations document in her sleeve. She left the study and went to the training courtyard and practiced sword forms for 2 hours in the cold without stopping, without drinking water, without acknowledging the frost forming on her eyelashes. When she finally stopped, her arms burning and her breath visible in the cold air, she stood very still for a long moment. Then she went to find Minyu. Minyu was in the medical study that the king had arranged for him the previous year, a small room adjacent to the royal physician's quarters, where he was permitted to study and experiment under supervision. He was grinding medicinal herbs when Saren arrived, and he looked up at her entrance with the immediate attention he gave to anything that presented differently than expected. She was breathing harder than her training usually left her. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was working to control an emotion rather than simply feeling it. "What happened?" he asked. Saren closed the door and sat on the floor rather than the stool, which meant she needed to be low and grounded, which meant whatever she was carrying was heavy. She told him. Minyu set down his grinding stone. He listened without moving. When she finished, the room held the sound of his careful, physician's breathing and nothing else. "She doesn't know we know," he said. "No, Jayan, I don't know yet. I came to you first." Minho thought for a while. Saren watched him think, and the room was warm with medicinal smells and the small brazier in the corner. And outside the palace went about its ordinary business completely unaware that something seismic had just shifted in this small room. Father isn't our biological father, Minyu said slowly, testing the sentence the way he tested unfamiliar medicine, looking for its properties. No, Yonsen is. According to the confession, yes. Mother has known this for our entire lives. She's known it from before we were born. Another silence. Minyu picked up a small dried herb and turned it over in his fingers, which was what he did when he was processing something difficult. She protected us, he said. Saren looked at him. She used us, Minyu said, with the even quality of someone unwilling to collapse complexity into simplicity. Both at the same time. We can be angry about the using and grateful for the protecting simultaneously. Those are not mutually exclusive. Saren pressed her lips together. She built her entire plan around us. We're the instruments of her revenge. Yes, Minyu set down the herb. And she also stayed awake every night to make sure we were safe. And she taught us everything we know. And she gave up whatever normal life she might have had to make us into people who could protect ourselves. He met his sister's eyes. The question isn't what she did. The question is what we do now. Confront her, Saren said immediately. Minyu agreed. We do, but how we confront her matters. Lied to us. Protected us from a truth that would have complicated our entire childhood with questions we couldn't act on. He paused. That's still a lie, but it's a different kind of lie than the kind that damages people. Minho, Saren said, and there was something raw in her voice that she was working to contain. We don't know who we are. Minho looked at his sister with the gentle clarity that was his particular genius. We know exactly who we are, he said. We are the children she built. That's not less real because the biology is different. You are still the person who beat the palace guard at 8 and practices sword forms in the frost because you can't stop until you understand something. I am still the person who stayed awake reading medical texts at age 6 because knowing how things worked felt more important than sleeping. Jian is still the person who sees the whole board. He reached out and took her hand. We are exactly who we are. The only thing that changes is the story of how we got here. Saren was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'm still angry. You should be, Minyu said. Anger is appropriate. I'm going to be angry too once I finish processing the shock. When will that be? Probably tomorrow. Despite herself, Saren almost smiled. We need to tell Jian. Already knows, Minyu said. Saren stared at him. What? She told him 3 weeks ago. I could tell something had shifted in him, but I didn't know what. Now I do, Minyu tilted his head. She told him, but not us, which means she was working up to telling us in order, oldest first, which means we were going to find out eventually anyway. We just found out faster. Through a misfiled document. Or a deliberately accessible document, Minyu said quietly. Mother doesn't misfile things. The thought settled over them both. She left it for us to find, Saren said slowly. I think she was trying to find a way to tell us and couldn't quite get there. So she left the door open and trusted us to walk through it when we were ready. Minyu picked up the herb again. Which is very her, isn't it? Letting us come to knowledge ourselves rather than being handed it. Saren exhaled long and slow. She is the most complicated person I have ever encountered. She's our mother, Minyu said simply. I think that's what mothers are. They confronted her together, all 3 of them. Jian, Minyu, and Saren, in HWA Yon's private study on a winter evening when the palace outside was lit by lanterns and the cold was absolute. HWA Yon looked at them as they filed in and closed the door, and she understood immediately what this was. Her face went through nothing. She held whatever she felt completely still and watched her children arrange themselves before her with the calm deliberateness of people who had clearly discussed this moment and agreed on their approach. Jian stood in the center. Minyu on his left. Saren on his right. It looked, HWA Yon thought, with a clarity that had nothing to do with strategy, like the way they had been born. Jian first. Minyu second. Saren last and smallest and fiercest. You know, she said, not a question. We know, Jian confirmed. How much? Everything, Saren said. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were not. There was a brightness in them that was not quite tears and not quite anger, but lived in the territory between. The confession, HWA Yon said. You found the confession. I found it, Saren said. And then I told Minyu. And then Minyu said Jian already knew because you told him. HWA Yon looked at Jian. He met her gaze steadily. I was waiting, he said simply. She nodded. I was trying to find the right way to tell you, she said to all 3 of them. I don't think there is a right way. I've been rewriting the conversation for months. Who is Prince Yonson? Minyu asked. Your biological father, HWA Yon said. There was no point in softening it now. The king's younger brother. He participated in a scheme arranged by the Queen Dowager before my first wedding. He signed a confession in exchange for exile. He has lived quietly on his country estate for the past 11 years. Have you had contact with him? Jian asked. One message, 11 years ago, reminding him of the confession's existence. Nothing since. He knows we exist. He knows I became pregnant following the incident. Whether he has drawn conclusions about what that means, I don't know. Saren stepped forward slightly. Her hand had moved unconsciously toward the sword she wasn't carrying, a gesture she made sometimes when she was managing something difficult. Does father know? The word father hung in the room with complicated weight. No, HWA Yon said. The king believes you are his children. You intended to keep it that way, Jian said. Yes. Because if he knew, the succession could be challenged. Jian was working it through as he spoke, the way he always did, out loud and precise. Our claim to the throne depends entirely on the belief that we are the king's legitimate heirs. The moment that belief is questioned, everything we have becomes contestable, HWA Yon said. So the secret protects us. The secret is the foundation everything else stands on, HWA Yon said. Every protection I've built, every alliance, every resource, all of it is meaningless if the secret falls. Room was very quiet. Then Minyu, who had been listening with his characteristic attentiveness, said, You've been carrying this alone for our entire lives. The weight of it, he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that caught in HWA Yon's chest. The weight of knowing that everything depended on a secret that could break everything. HWA Yon looked at her second son, at his open face and his gentle eyes and his refusal to make anything smaller than it was. Yes, she said, and her voice was not quite steady. That must have been lonely, he said. HWA Yon pressed her lips together. She would not cry. She did not cry in front of people. Not since the night after the children were born, when she had cried from love in the private dark. But Minyu was looking at her with eyes that saw her the way Saren saw everyone's motivations, with the specific and devastating clarity of a person who understood exactly what something cost. Yes, she said. It was lonely. Saren made a sound. Something sharp and controlled that wanted to be bigger than she was letting it be. You should have told us. You were children. We're your children. There's a difference. Saren's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together the same way HWA Yon had. The physical similarity, the inherited gesture, was so precise that something moved in HWA Yon's chest like a key turning. Right, HWA Yon said. I should have found a way. I was afraid. What? Saren demanded. Of losing you, HWA Yon said, and the honesty of it stripped everything else away. Not to the truth. To the weight of the truth. You've lived your whole lives believing your father is your father, believing the ground under your feet is solid. I was afraid that telling you would take that away. That you would look at everything differently and find it unbearable. You decided that was our choice to make, not yours, Minyu said. Eventually, when you were ready. She looked at Saren. I think I left the document where you could find it because I couldn't find the words. That was cowardly. Saren stared at her. You are the least cowardly person I know. About most things, HWA Yon agreed. About you three, I have been nothing but afraid. Something shifted in the room. The sharp edges of the confrontation softened, not because the difficulty went away, but because difficulty shared between people who love each other changes shape. Jian spoke first. What happens now? That depends on what you want, HWA Yon said. I've been making decisions for you since before you were born. I'd like to stop doing that. The three children exchanged a look. The silent communication of siblings who had grown up thinking together, whose arguments and agreements moved through expressions and small gestures as efficiently as spoken language. We protect the secret, Jian said. Not because you need us to, because we choose to, because we are who we are regardless of the biology, and we don't need that throne any less because of who fathered us. I want to meet him, Minyu said. Not urgently, just clearly. Yonson, not now, not soon maybe, but eventually. I want to know what he is. HWA Yon nodded. That's fair. Saren was last. She was looking at her mother with the expression she wore when she had already made a decision and was just confirming it internally. Still angry, she said. Not at you. I'm working out who I'm angry at, but I'm going to be angry for a while, and I need you to know that doesn't mean I'm leaving. I know, HWA Yon said, and I need you to stop making decisions for us without telling us. even when you think it's protecting us. Try, HWA Yon said, and the honesty of the qualification, the admission that she couldn't promise to override every protective instinct, was more genuine than a clean yes would have been. Saren looked at her for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and sat beside her mother on the floor, folding herself down with the flexible economy of a trained fighter. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, shoulder to shoulder, which was Saren's particular language for things she couldn't put into words. Minyu sat on HWA Yon's other side. Jian remained standing for a moment, looking at the three of them with an expression that was not quite emotion and not quite calculation, but lived in the space between. Then he sat too. The four of them sat on the floor of HWA Yon's study, surrounded by maps and documents and the evidence of 2 lifetimes of survival, and said nothing for a long time. It was the most honest moment HWA Yon could remember in either of her lives. Subscribe right now if you felt something just now. I'm not asking as a content creator asking for numbers. I'm asking as a person who wants this story to reach everyone who needs it tonight. Like if this family just broke your heart in the best possible way, comment the word family if you're still here, because that is what this has always been about. Not revenge, not power, family, but stay, because the king still doesn't know the truth, and when he finds out, it won't be quiet. The Queen Dowager died on the first day of the new year, not dramatically. Not with speeches or final revelations or the elaborate theatrical exits that powerful people sometimes arranged for themselves. She died in her bed in the early hours of the morning, with her physicians present and her personal ladies around her, and the winter cold pressing against the palace windows. She died, according to the physician's report, peacefully. HWA Yon received the news at dawn and sat with it for an hour before doing anything. She had hated this woman, had spent 2 lifetimes in the long shadow of what she had done, had carried the memory of falling from that cliff, of the cold water, of dying with 3 unborn children as both wound and fuel for everything she'd built. And now she was gone, without confrontation, without the Queen Dowager looking at what HWA Yon had built and knowing she had been responsible for building it, without the final reckoning that HWA Yon had promised herself, just gone, quietly, in her sleep. HWA Yon felt cheated. And then she felt something else, something underneath the anger, smaller and more honest. Relief, because the Queen Dowager's death removed the most dangerous piece from the board. The threat that had existed since before the children were born was simply gone, and nothing HWA Yon had planned or built or sacrificed had been necessary to accomplish it. It had just happened. The way some things just happened, without drama or justice, without giving the people who needed the ending any particular ending at all. She attended the funeral in full mourning dress. She stood at Jinhyun's side through every ritual, every ceremony, every formal expression of grief for a woman who had tried to have her killed. She kept her face appropriate. She said the correct things. And afterward, alone in her study, she looked at the genealogical charts on the wall and crossed off one name. Not triumphantly, just finally, 3 months after the Queen Dowager's death, on a spring evening when the palace gardens were full of early blossoms, Jinhyun came to find HWA Yon, not to her formal chambers, not to the family quarters. He came to her private study, which meant he had been watching her patterns long enough to know she spent evenings here when the children were occupied, which meant he had been paying closer attention than she'd realized. He knocked. 3 times, even-spaced. She recognized the echo of Jian's knock and understood that her son had inherited it from his father even without spending his early years in proximity to him. And the genetic irony of that was something she filed away in the complicated place where she kept things that were both true and painful. "Come in," she said. He entered and looked around the room properly this time. Not a glance, but a full, deliberate look at the maps, the documents, the locked cabinet, the accumulated evidence of her interior life. "Never been in here," he said. "No," she agreed. "It suits you." He pulled the chair across from her desk, the same chair Jian had sat in months ago, and sat with the particular kind of stillness that came from a decision already made before entering the room. She waited. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right." He looked at his hands for a moment, the habit of someone choosing words with the seriousness they deserved. "I have been in love with Lady Min for 15 years, he began. "I thought it was the permanent condition of my life, the way some things are just fixed. The ground is under your feet, the sky is above you. I love Lady Min." Hwa said nothing. After she left, Jinhyun continued, I expected grief. The specific kind of grief that comes from losing something you'd built your interior life around. But what I felt instead was, he paused, clarity, as if something that had been producing a constant noise I'd learned to stop hearing had finally gone quiet. Hwa was very still. I started noticing things I'd been looking past for years, he said. My children, the people they'd become, the way the palace functions better now than it did 10 years ago, and why that is. He looked up from his hands. I started noticing you, Jinhyun, Hwa said. His name, no title, because the conversation had moved into territory where titles were irrelevant. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I understand what I've been. I understand the years I wasted. I understand that you built everything you have deliberately separate from me because you couldn't trust that I would stay. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to trust that now because I said some words. Then what are you asking? She said carefully. I'm asking for the chance to be worth trusting, not as a declaration, as a process. He exhaled. I know I destroyed something before it could exist. In our marriage in the early years, I'm asking if something could exist now, whatever that would look like. Study was very quiet around them. Outside, the spring wind moved through the garden blossoms, and the sound of the children's voices came faintly from somewhere in the family quarters. Saren evidently winning an argument with Jayan about something that Minyu was mediating. The sounds of her life. Everything she had built and protected and kept alive. Hwa looked at the man across from her. At the king who had been a crown prince who had rejected her in bridal robes in another life. At the father of her children, in every way that mattered, regardless of biology. At the man who had learned, slowly and imperfectly and too late but genuinely, to see his family. She thought about the first timeline, about dying on that riverbank, about the curse she'd spoken into the dark water. She thought about what she had wanted then, and what she wanted now, and whether they were the same thing, they were not the same thing. They had stopped being the same thing somewhere in the middle of 10 years of dinners and conversations and watching him learn to be present. Have a confession to make, she said. He looked at her. Waiting, she told him, not about the biological truth of the children. She was not ready for that. Perhaps she would never be ready for that. Perhaps that truth would have to remain the foundation's secret until she died and took it with her. But she told him about the first life. About the rejection, the exile, the cliff, the death. About waking up at 17 with a dead woman's memories and spending years building the architecture of his destruction. About the revenge she had planned and the evidence she had gathered and the decade she had spent preparing to dismantle him. She told him about the cabinet. She told him about Jinho and the money and the network. She told him about the moment she had sat in a kitchen on their children's birthday.